At 72 years old, I thought my greatest legacy was the $3,500,000 I wired to build my daughter's dream. I stood in the grand foyer of Crestview Academy's new Texas campus, watching Lauren host a lavish donor preview reception, swelling with a mother's pride. But then I walked into her private office and saw the framed property deed sitting proudly on her mahogany desk. That was the moment I realized I hadn't built an educational empire for my daughter. I had funded a massive, quiet theft. The Texas evening was warm, but the air conditioning inside the state-of-the-art facility kept the grand foyer perfectly cool. I watched Lauren from across the room. She was glowing, commanding the attention of wealthy donors as the new principal of Crestview Academy. I had wired $3,500,000 directly from my personal accounts to turn her vision into reality. In my heart, it was a gift. On paper, my attorney had done what attorneys do. He had structured it as a founder's financing agreement, a loan secured by a recorded lien on the campus itself, with Lauren signing as the borrower. There was a default clause, too, buried deep in the fine print. I had waved it off back then as lawyerly caution. Lauren had signed without reading past the first page. Every brick, every gleaming window, every perfectly polished floor was supposed to be my gift to her future. It was supposed to be our family's crowning achievement. Instead, Brenda was acting like she owned the place. Justin's overbearing mother was parading through the crowd, snapping her fingers at the catering staff and treating them like her personal servants. Her loud voice carried over the string quartet, boasting to anyone who would listen about the custom Italian marble she had personally selected for the entryway. I bit my tongue and smiled politely. Let Brenda have her moment of secondhand glory. This campus belonged to Lauren, or so I believed. The noise and the endless handshakes were starting to give me a headache, so I slipped away, seeking a quiet moment. I walked down the pristine hallway and let myself into Lauren's new private office to leave a small congratulatory gift on her mahogany desk. The room smelled of fresh paint and expensive leather. As I set the gift down, a framed document caught my eye. It was an officially stamped property deed, displayed proudly right next to a family photo. I smiled, adjusting my reading glasses to look closer at the fine print, but as the legal jargon came into focus, my smile died. The blood drained from my face, leaving a cold, sickening hollow in my chest. I read the lines again, praying my 72-year-old eyes were failing me. They were not. The campus I had paid for was not registered to Crestview Academy. It was not registered to Lauren. According to the official state stamp, the entire property was registered solely to a private trust. A trust controlled entirely by Brenda. I forced myself to breathe. In, out, I smoothed the skirt of my evening gown, turned my back on that sickening property deed, and walked out of Lauren's private office. The reception was still roaring in the grand foyer. I painted a bright, oblivious smile on my face and waded back into the sea of wealthy donors. I clinked champagne glasses. I hugged my daughter, ignoring the way my skin crawled when she squeezed me back. I even nodded politely when Justin's mother, Brenda, cornered me by the ice sculpture. This time, it was not to boast. It was to pat my hand and remind me, in that syrupy voice, how lucky I was that the family had let me be part of something so grand. I played the proud, supportive mother perfectly, burying the cold realization of betrayal deep in my gut. I smiled until my cheeks ached, enduring every toast and every false compliment. But the moment the last guest departed and the campus doors were locked, I drove straight back to my house. It was 2 a.m. when I finally sat down in my dark home study. The silence of the house was absolute, but my mind was screaming. I opened my laptop. Justin had recently installed new security firewalls across the entire Crestview Academy network. He had boasted about how impenetrable they were at our last family dinner, practically patting me on the head as he assured me my investment was entirely safe in his hands. But Justin didn't know everything. He didn't know that I had personally written the initial network infrastructure years ago, leaving myself a legacy founder's backdoor access code that superseded every new protocol he could ever dream up. My fingers flew across the keyboard. Within minutes, I had bypassed his supposedly flawless security firewalls and breached the Academy's master financial ledger. I started combing through the accounts. The building funds were exactly as I expected: drained, transferred out, repurposed to build a campus my daughter didn't even own. But that wasn't the worst of it. As I dug into the operational accounts, a series of red flags caught my eye. Hidden, unauthorized wire transfers were bleeding a very specific account dry. My heart stopped. It was the Crestview Hope Scholarship Fund. I had established that reserve myself, explicitly setting aside $1,500,000 to provide full-ride tuitions for underprivileged Texas students. It was the soul of the academy, the reason I had agreed to fund this expansion in the first place. And it was completely gone. Every single cent of it had been systematically siphoned away. I traced the digital breadcrumbs, following the money through a labyrinth of disguised transactions. The funds didn't stay in Texas. They were routed offshore, funneling directly into a Panamanian shell company registered as Helios Holdings. I knew that name. I had seen it on a piece of mail, mistakenly delivered to my house months ago, addressed to Brenda. I dug deeper into Helios Holdings, pulling international banking records. The stolen scholarship money wasn't being used for investments or real estate. It was being wired straight from Panama to Switzerland to pay off massive, illegal Swiss tax evasion penalties. Brenda was drowning in international tax fraud, and my daughter and son-in-law had stolen from poor children to bail her out. And then I understood the leash. Brenda hadn't simply asked them for help. She owned them. Justin's name sat on those same offshore accounts, tangled in the fraud beside hers, and she had made sure of it. If Brenda went down, Justin went down with her. Lauren wasn't betraying me for a title. She was doing it to keep her husband out of a federal prison cell, and Brenda held that threat over both their heads like a blade. The sheer magnitude of the theft made my stomach churn, but a dark instinct told me to keep looking. If they were capable of stealing the campus and robbing the scholarship fund, what else were they hiding? I accessed Lauren's personal administrative drive. Most of it was mundane: curriculum schedules, staffing reports, vendor invoices. Then I saw a hidden digital folder. Its title was simple: Clinical, Transition_M, M for Mary. My hands shook as I clicked it open. Inside, I found 2 documents that made the blood freeze in my veins. The first was a medical power of attorney, complete with my forged signature, granting Lauren absolute control over my healthcare and personal estate. The second was a drafted legal petition. It was a formal request to a judge to have me declared mentally incompetent. The petition outlined a detailed, fabricated history of severe cognitive decline, culminating in a plan to permanently lock me away in a high-security Alzheimer's care facility in Arizona. They had even selected the facility, noting that the isolation of the Arizona desert would be ideal to prevent me from causing any distress to myself or others. The petition was scheduled to be filed right before the upcoming annual audit. They weren't just going to steal my money. They were going to steal my freedom, my mind, my entire life, locking me in a desert facility so I could never expose the missing scholarship money. I sat in the glow of the monitor, the digital trail of their betrayal, spelling out my doom, and felt the last remnants of a mother's unconditional love turn to ice. Has a painful betrayal ever forced you to completely rebuild your life and redefine your family? Share your story in the comments below. I sat in the suffocating silence of my dark study, the cold glow of the computer monitor, illuminating the Arizona medical petition that would end my life as I knew it. My first burning instinct was to storm over to Lauren's house, kick down her front door, and demand to know how she could sell her own mother to a high-security lockdown unit just to cover Brenda's offshore tax fraud. But a cold, terrifyingly rational part of my brain took over, silencing the panicked mother inside me. A direct confrontation would be catastrophic. If I tipped my hand now, Lauren and Justin would panic. They would instantly wipe the academy servers, destroying the digital trail of the stolen scholarship fund. Worse, they would rush that forged medical petition into the county clerk's office the moment it opened. And I knew how these things worked. Once a competency petition is filed, it does not simply vanish. It poisons everything. My word becomes the word of a woman someone has already declared unfit. I would spend months, maybe years, fighting just to prove I still owned my own mind. And by then, the audit would be long buried and the money long gone. I needed time. I needed them to feel absolutely safe and completely in control. And the only way to make a predator feel safe is to play the wounded prey. I had to become the declining, senile victim they were already claiming I was. The next morning, I walked into the administrative offices with a slow, shuffling step, letting my shoulders slump and my eyes wander. I found Lauren and Justin in the conference room, reviewing catering invoices from the previous night's reception. I sat down heavily, rubbing my temples as if confused by the morning light. Lauren, wearing a mask of tight, false patience, handed me a minor vendor check for landscaping supplies, asking for my routine approval signature. I picked up the pen, intentionally letting my hand tremble, and deliberately, painstakingly, signed my late husband's name on the bottom line. I slid the invalid check back across the mahogany table. Then, looking around the room with wide, vacant eyes, I asked Lauren when we were going to finish the new advanced science curriculum rollout, the exact same advanced curriculum I had championed from the very beginning, the one I had personally hired the finest specialists to build, finalized and celebrated only 3 months ago. Lauren froze. She stared down at the dead man's signature on the check, then slowly lifted her gaze to my face. "Mom," she said, her voice dripping with an almost rehearsed, sickly sweet sympathy, "we finished the science curriculum in March. Don't you remember?" I shook my head slowly, letting a look of helpless panic wash over my features, murmuring that my memory was just a little foggy today. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Lauren subtly pull her smartphone from her blazer pocket, angling the camera lens directly toward my face. She was recording me. My own daughter was filming my manufactured cognitive decline to use as Exhibit A in her petition to lock me away. She glanced over her shoulder at Justin, and they exchanged a quick, thrilled smirk. It was a look of pure, victorious greed. They thought they had won. They thought my mind was finally shattering into pieces. I excused myself, claiming I needed to go home and lie down, leaving them to silently celebrate their impending triumph. But I didn't go home to rest. I drove to the industrial edge of town, pulling into the flickering neon shadows of a dark diner parking lot. My lawyer, Arthur, was already waiting in the passenger seat of his sedan. Arthur had been my most trusted confidant for 30 years, and as I slid into his car and handed him the encrypted flash drive containing all the server evidence, his warm smile faded. I told him everything. The Panamanian shell company, Brenda's Swiss tax evasion, the stolen scholarship funds, and the horrifying Arizona medical petition. Arthur's face tightened into a mask of cold, professional fury. He weighed the little drive in his palm and shook his head slowly. "We don't hand this to a judge," he said quietly. "How you found it would sink us, but it's a map. It tells the federal agents exactly which accounts to pull and which wires to trace, and they will get every record the legal way with their own subpoenas." The evidence on that drive was not my case. It was my compass. We sat under the dim streetlights for 2 hours, building a lethal silent counterstrike out of the one weapon they never knew I was holding. Arthur pulled up the original founder's financing agreement, the one Lauren had signed the day the money was wired. It was still valid. It was still enforceable, and the default clause we had buried in the fine print 2 years ago was still sitting there, patient and waiting. Any fraudulent executive action, embezzlement, forgery, a stolen takeover, would trigger an immediate, unappealable default. The lien was attached to the campus itself, not to a name on a deed. It did not matter whose trust they had hidden the building inside. If they defaulted, the property was mine to seize. All we had to do was give Lauren one more signature to forge. By the time I returned to the academy, the administrative wing was deserted. I walked straight into my private office and opened my bottom desk drawer. I pulled out a blank, voluntary transfer of executive power document, a standard administrative form we kept on file for emergency successions. I placed it squarely in the dead center of my desk pad, right where Lauren would undoubtedly find it during her daily snooping. I left the signature line entirely blank, explicitly baiting her. She needed a quick, clean way to take total administrative control of the campus before the upcoming audit exposed the missing funds. She already had my forged signature perfected on the medical documents. I knew her greed would not allow her to resist forging it one more time to claim the academy completely. I turned off the light and walked out, leaving the trap perfectly set. The grand ribbon-cutting ceremony in the Academy's main auditorium was a masterpiece of glittering hypocrisy, a perfect stage for the final act of their betrayal. I sat in the front row, wrapped tightly in a woolen shawl I didn't need, playing the frail, confused old woman one last time. The massive room was packed to the brim with wealthy donors, local politicians, and the eager parents of prospective students, all dressed in their finest afternoon attire. The stage ahead of us was adorned with towering floral arrangements and a giant, pristine silk ribbon waiting to be cut. Before the official proceedings even began, Brenda was already working the crowd near the front rows. She wore an ostentatious diamond necklace that caught the stage lights, laughing loudly and gesturing grandly toward the gleaming architecture around us. I sat quietly, keeping my head bowed and my hands trembling slightly in my lap as I listened to her boast to a group of potential investors. She called the campus her new educational empire, shamelessly claiming she had personally overseen every minor detail of the construction to ensure it met her own exacting world-class standards. Justin stood right beside her, nodding eagerly and holding her champagne glass, playing the dutiful son to the woman whose massive financial sins he was actively helping to cover up. They were drowning in arrogance, completely blind to the storm that was about to break over their heads. The house lights slowly dimmed, the low chatter of the crowd hushed into expectant silence, and Lauren walked gracefully onto the stage. She approached the podium, clutching a thick manila folder to her chest like a shield. She looked out at the audience, took a deep, visibly trembling breath, and began her performance. She didn't talk about the new state-of-the-art building or the bright future of the students. Instead, she spoke about the heartbreaking burdens of family. She reached into her folder, pulled out the forged voluntary transfer of executive power document, and laid it delicately on the podium. Feigning tears, she dabbed at her dry eyes with a monogrammed tissue. Her voice broke perfectly as she announced that her mother's tragic mental decline had reached a point of no return, that I could no longer manage my own basic affairs, let alone guide a prestigious educational institution. She told the hushed, sympathetic room that it absolutely broke her heart, but for the safety of the academy and the good of the students, her mother had been forced to step down, requiring her to assume total administrative and executive control. She held up the forged document, the ink of my fake signature visible to the front row. The audience murmured in collective, gentle sympathy. Justin looked at her with an expression of manufactured, deep sorrow. Brenda patted her heart dramatically. It was time. I stood up. I let the woolen shawl slip from my shoulders and fall into a heap on the floor. The slight, pathetic tremor I had feigned for the past 24 hours vanished instantly. I straightened my spine, pulling my posture perfectly, rigidly straight, and walked toward the stairs leading up to the stage. The sympathetic murmurs in the auditorium died down into a confused, heavy, suffocating silence. I climbed the steps, my heels clicking sharply, rhythmically against the polished wood. Lauren saw me approaching, and the color instantly drained from her face, leaving her chalk white. Her fake tears vanished. She stepped back from the podium, her hands shaking for real this time, acting as if I had suddenly caught fire. I took my place behind the microphone, looking out at the sea of shocked faces. and then slowly turned my head to look directly at my daughter. My voice, when I finally spoke, echoed through the vast auditorium, ice cold and razor sharp, shattering the dementia illusion in a fraction of a second. "My mind is perfectly intact," I said, the words cutting through the dead silence like a blade. "But your moral compass is entirely bankrupt." A collective, audible gasp rippled through the wealthy donors. Justin half stood from his seat, sheer panic flashing across his features. I didn't give them a single moment to recover or interrupt. I pulled my tablet from my bag, firmly plugged the connecting cable into the podium's presentation system, and tapped the screen. The massive digital projector behind me flared to life. I didn't show them educational statistics or campus blueprints. I displayed the Academy's master financial ledger, magnified 30 feet high. I pointed to the screen, tracking the hidden, unauthorized wire transfers for the entire crowd to see. I explained, my voice echoing with righteous, undeniable fury, that Lauren and Justin had systematically drained the Crestview Hope Scholarship Fund. I showed the audience exactly how they had stolen $1,500,000 meant for underprivileged Texas students. The crowd erupted into horrified whispers, but I raised my voice over the rising chaos. One tap. The next slide traced the money out of Texas, through a shell company in Panama, and into a bank in Switzerland. I did not read them the account numbers. I did not need to. I simply looked down at Brenda, gripping her chair, her face gone white, and let the room follow my eyes to her. "Every dollar those children lost," I said, "went to pay her Swiss tax penalties." A woman in the front row gasped and pressed a hand to her mouth. Someone shouted for security. The whispers rose into a roar. Utter chaos erupted in the auditorium. Donors were shouting in outrage. Justin was frantically reaching for his phone, his hands fumbling blindly. Brenda stood up, screaming hysterically that it was all a lie, a malicious fabrication by a sick, senile old woman. But her screaming was cut violently short. At the very back of the auditorium, the heavy mahogany double doors swung open with a resounding crash. My lawyer, Arthur, strode into the room, and close behind him came a team of stern-faced federal IRS agents in dark windbreakers. The agents didn't hesitate, and they didn't slow down. They marched straight down the center aisle, their eyes locked completely on the front row. They bypassed Justin and Lauren entirely, surrounding a sputtering, hyperventilating Brenda. While she shrieked indignities and threatened to sue every single person in the room, the federal agents calmly handcuffed her for international tax fraud and forcefully escorted her out of the building. The crowd watched the arrest in stunned, absolute silence. I turned slowly back to Lauren. She was trembling violently, gripping the edges of the podium so hard her knuckles were white, her eyes wide with terror as she realized the inescapable magnitude of her exposure. She looked down at the forged transfer document, then looked up at me, opening her mouth to beg, to plead, to offer some pathetic excuse. I didn't let her speak. I looked dead into her eyes and revealed the final, inescapable trap. I leaned into the microphone, ensuring every single word was crystal clear to her and to the silent room. I told her that by forging my signature on that specific document and attempting a fraudulent executive takeover, she had officially triggered the catastrophic default clause on the new building's financing. The $3,500,000 I had wired was not a charitable grant. It was a strict, legally binding founder's loan secured by a lien on the campus. A lien that followed the building itself, no matter whose name they buried the title under. Her documented fraud had just instantly defaulted it. I announced that I was foreclosing on the building immediately, seizing every physical asset and locking them out of the campus permanently. The private trust Brenda had built to steal the property was now holding nothing but worthless, insurmountable debt. I stepped away from the podium, leaving my daughter standing in the ruins of her own greed, completely and utterly destroyed. The fallout from the ceremony was absolute and merciless. Stripped of the campus and exposed to federal investigators, Lauren and Justin were left entirely bankrupt, their carefully constructed facade of wealth reduced to nothing. The agents didn't stop with Brenda. Their investigation into the offshore accounts quickly swallowed my daughter and son-in-law. Facing severe federal embezzlement charges, the united front they had maintained instantly shattered. In a desperate, pathetic attempt to save himself from a lengthy prison sentence, Justin immediately turned on Lauren, handing over digital records to the authorities and filing for divorce before the week was even over. They had built their marriage entirely on greed, and when the money vanished, they turned on each other like starving wolves. It was a fitting, lonely end for the people who had tried to lock me in the desert. The morning after the ceremony, the atmosphere at the Texas campus was fraught with panic. I called an emergency assembly, standing before the terrified academy staff and the deeply worried parents of the scholarship students. They had read the morning news. They knew about the arrests, the offshore scandals, and the defaulted loans. They looked at me with wide, fearful eyes, expecting to hear that the doors were closing forever, that their children's education had been stolen. Instead, I stood at the podium, no longer playing the frail, confused victim, but as the sole executive director, and assured them that the school was completely safe under my direct command. The fraudulent administration had been excised, and the true mission of the academy would proceed uninterrupted. But words were not enough to restore their faith. I needed to make them whole immediately. The offshore accounts had been frozen by federal agents, meaning the stolen fund would be tied up in litigation for years. I couldn't let those students wait for the wheels of justice to slowly turn. That afternoon, I contacted my financial advisors and ordered the immediate liquidation of my private stock portfolios. I took the financial hit on the early sell-offs, and I personally transferred every cent needed to fully refund the $1,500,000 directly back into the Crestview Hope Scholarship Fund. I wanted to ensure that not a single child's future was harmed or delayed by my daughter's terrible choices. The money was replaced, the accounts were secured, and the students were safe. Months later, I sat in the front row of the very same auditorium where the illusion of my family had finally been shattered. This time, I wasn't there to tear anything down. I was there to watch the first class of scholarship students graduate. As I watched those brilliant, hopeful young men and women walk across the stage with absolute pride, holding their diplomas high, I realized the true nature of my victory. I hadn't just destroyed the enemies who tried to bury me. I had elevated the very concept of revenge, turning a deeply personal betrayal into a lasting act of creation. True justice isn't simply about salting the earth of those who wronged you. It is about taking the power they tried to steal and using it to plant vital seeds for the future. You cannot change the people who betray you, but you can change what grows from the ashes they leave behind. As the auditorium erupted in applause for the graduates, I knew, with absolute certainty, that my true legacy was the beautiful, thriving community I was uplifting, not the toxic bloodline I had finally cut away. Has a painful betrayal ever forced you to completely rebuild your life and redefine your family? Share your story in the comments below.